you will learn about network isolated AKS cluster, the feature that allows you to isolate your cluster in terms of networking so that your cluster will be disconnected or offline. By default, when we create an AKS cluster, the default outbound type will be of type load balancer. This means that the egress traffic coming out from your cluster will traverse through the load balancer through a specific IP address. This means that your cluster have unrestricted access and connection to the internet. To restrict this access and to have more control over the egress traffic, you can force all that egress traffic to go through a firewall like the Azure firewall, where there you can control that traffic and decide whether to let it go or not. And typically you would open it for the required services that AKS uses, like for example the connection to MCR to retrieve the system images, or the connection with Entra ID, Azure Monitor for the metrics and the logs, or connection to the control plane if you have a public cluster. This was the standard solution until we get another requirement from customers. Those customers want their AKS clusters to be completely offline, completely disconnected. So for that, we did have another option for specifying the outbound type, which is the type network isolated cluster. With this mode, instead of pulling the system images from directly Microsoft Artifact Registry, or call it also Microsoft Container Registry, AKS will pull these images from its own ACR. Actually, what will happen here is that the images that were available on Microsoft Artifact Registry will be available in ACR through the artifact cache feature within ACR, and ACR will be available to only the customer AKS cluster through private endpoint, and with this way AKS will rely only on its own ACR to get those system images. It does not need any more connection to Microsoft Artifact Registry. So AKS here in this case does not need access more than to its virtual network, where it does have the private endpoint connected. Technically, how this works: so when we create an AKS cluster with network isolated cluster enabled, which could be achieved by specifying the outbound type to be equal none if you want to configure yourself the outbound or the egress connection, how your cluster can connect to the external resources, or by specifying the block option here, which will block any egress traffic even if there are a way to connect to the external resources. So when you enable network isolated cluster, the public load balancer won't be created unless you expose a public service. So typically with AKS, whenever we create an AKS cluster with standard configuration, we should see a load balancer created within the node resource group. But here with network isolated, there is no public load balancer, because here we want to restrict the egress traffic. And remember that public load balancer was used mainly for the egress traffic and also for the ingress traffic. Now, if you create later a service that is exposed with a type load balancer, then that way, in that case, a load balancer will be created but used only for the ingress traffic, not for egress. Note that also here this should work with the private ACR, because here we want to keep AKS private, so it also makes sense to keep also ACR private. So that for that here we have a private endpoint for the ACR and its own private DNS zone that will resolve the access for ACR. The ACR of this case, so it will have the images available, the images that are needed by the system pods within the AKS cluster. Those images will not be available within the repositories right here from ACR, but actually they will be available within the cache of ACR. So from within the cache here, you will see the image being cached from the source that is mcr.microsoft.com. So, and here it will cache all the images into our registry. The images hosted by MCR are typically the system images, but also there are lots of other images that you can take a look at. So if, for example, if you want to deploy an Nginx image, then chances are high that you will find that image available within Microsoft Artifact Registry. If you go to this URL, then you will find the images that are available here, and here there are actually hundreds of those images. Follow me next for a demonstration to see how network isolated works. In this demonstration, you will learn how to create a network isolated AKS cluster. For that, we'll create the AKS cluster, then we'll enable the network isolated through the outbound type equal none or block, and then we'll use the ACR with a private connection through a private endpoint to get the system images from the Microsoft Artifact registry, so that AKS will not have any requirement to connect to another registry other than its own registry that lives within its own network or its own virtual network. To create all of these resources, you have this GitHub repository where from the folder number 650, where here you can find the README file that describes all the steps that will go through all the commands to create the resources. And also you have another PowerShell script right here that contains also the different commands if you prefer to use PowerShell. I have cloned that repo in my machine right here, so here I have access to that commands.powershell file to create the resources, or again you can use the readme file. And from here actually I have deployed all of these resources using the command line, as you can see here, by defining the resource variables and then creating a resource group, creating the virtual network, and then creating the subnet for the cluster. And note here for the AKS subnet, actually we have disabled the outbound default access. This means that from that subnet there is no outbound connectivity. And then we have created an ACR that uses the artifact cache for that actually, or that uses private endpoint, and for that the ACR needs to use the SQ premium. And note here for that ACR we disabled the network or the public network enabled, because it will only connect to, or it should not be available to any other resource other than the AKS that already lives within its own network perimeter. Then we enable the cache or the artifact cache within the ACR registry, and here let's make it slightly bigger, and here we enable actually the source repo to be the Microsoft Container Registry, mcr.microsoft.com, and then we get all the images from that registry to be available into our ACR. Then we create the private endpoint for the ACR, then we create the DNS zone. We link the DNS zone to the virtual network of the cluster so that AKS can resolve the domain name for ACR, and then we create the record for ACR, so that the name will resolve to the private IP of ACR. And then we configure the second IP for the data within ACR. Remember, when you create a private ACR, you should have actually two endpoints, one for the API and the second one for the data. And then we create the control plane identity and the kubelet identity. We give it the right ACR pull rule so that AKS can use that role in order to pull images from ACR. And at the end we create an AKS cluster, and here for our cluster it will be a private cluster because we are looking for network isolation. But more interestingly here is that we have those two or three parameters. First of all is the outbound type now here equal to none. Remember, with network isolated, this parameter now is no longer required to be load balancer or UDR. Now it could be none or it could be block. None, it means that the cluster will not have any way to connect unless you specify a way to connect, like you implement a NAT gateway into your virtual network. And the block means that even if there is a way to connect to outside, then the AKS will not connect, will be restricted to connect. For the other two parameters, here we specify the container registry resource ID. This means that AKS will rely on this registry in order to get the updates and to also download the images from for the system pods, and it will not rely anymore on the Microsoft ACR, which is the default configuration. And then it says that you can get those images from ACR, not from the registry or not from the repository, but actually from the cache of ACR instead of the repository. Once those changes have been made, from here you can see the output of our cluster right now, and here somewhere you can see that the outbound type now is set to none. And also you can see we have a new block called bootstrap profile, where here we have a reference to the container registry ID with the artifact source set to cache. Now once the cluster is created successfully and I've connected to the cluster through a AKS get credential, I'll go to check if the system pods were downloaded correctly. So for that, I'll use the AKS command invoke, because here my AKS cluster is private. So either I connect through a Jumpbox machine bastion, or I just use the AKS command invoke, which is easier for me in this case. So here we can see all the system pods that were created successfully, and they were all pulled from ACR. Now let me try to go to connect to the internet, or actually to get an image that is not from MCR or from ACR. Let's try, for example, this Nginx image that is hosted within Docker Hub. So I run the command kubectl run nginx, and here you see the output coming from this command, and this is now telling me that the pod is created. Actually, this is not true. If I try to get the pods from the default namespace, then here you will see that the pod is creating. But if we try a few seconds later, we'll see that we have an error, which is image pull backoff. Actually, the container could not be downloaded because AKS does not have access to outside of its network. So now to deploy your images from your ACR to AKS, your images should be in your ACR, only on your ACR. But however, you still, or AKS still have access to the MCR in case it needs, for example, to update the system images. And we can verify that actually if we try here to deploy the Nginx image coming from MCR, from the registry mcr.microsoft.com. And by the way, if you go to that link mcr.microsoft.com, then from here you can see you will have access to the Microsoft container registry, where you see lots of the images that are deployed here, and some of these images are used by AKS. And also some of these images, because we have enabled the ACR artifact cache, you can see that in your ACR, if you go here to cache, you should see a rule here created that will make all of the images available in MCR available within your container registry through the cache. So for that, you see here the container is created, but let's check again if it was created successfully or not. So I run kubectl get pods, and here I get my second pod, which is called my Nginx MCR. Now it's running successfully. Thank you.